Welcome to the Strong Enough Podcast, your relationship wellness podcast. I'm your host, Claudia. Today's guest is going to share with us how addiction ruined his first marriage, nearly took his second, and almost took his life. However, he was then able to forgive himself, heal his marriage, and now he is better and stronger than ever. Please help me in welcoming Jeff Bowman. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Doing good. Been looking forward to this.
I have been looking forward to it as well. So I'm excited to jump right in. But first, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
My name is Jeff Bowman. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a believer in Christ. I work a pretty demanding job. And 10 years ago, my life imploded because of my poor choices.
That was a very succinct background description. And I think we're going to hit on all of those things that you just mentioned. So why don't we start with growing up? I know that there were some challenges that you experienced growing up. Maybe there was some alcoholism, codependency in your family. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. First of all, I want to say that everybody's had stuff in their life. So this is not an attempt to make it sound like pity poor me. I had it worse than anybody else. Not that at all. As a matter of fact, I'm a big proponent of everybody's had things happen to them to some varying degree. But I'm a bigger proponent of the personal responsibility of how we handle those situations and how we deal with them, no matter how late in life we may choose to finally deal with them. So I did grow up in a home with an alcoholic father and a codependent mother. I was loved. I'm not going to deny that. I was loved, but in the limited capacity that we were all available to do such in that home environment. I wasn't beaten, but it was not typical. In a way of at least of what I saw in some of my friends' families. And maybe they had other things going on too. But it was bad enough that I know my friends' parents knew that my home was definitely different.
What did those things teach you about love and about relationships as you were growing up in that environment?
I think some of it was an unhealthy self-reliance. Like, if I wanted to do it, I needed to do it for myself because I couldn't really count on somebody else to do it for me. And while that could be a positive attribute, at a really young age, it became a survival mechanism. I also learned to be the comedian, to diffuse a horrible situation or a tense situation with, comedy, which was received at times well, and other times the timing couldn't have been worse. But it's what I learned, and it's what I, used to try to diffuse or deflect the situation that was there.
When you were in that younger stage, did you gain any other coping mechanisms that you would utilize on a regular basis?
Yes, and there begins the real part of the story for me. I think I was 6 or 7 years old. I had a wonderful neighbor who had a non-attached basement. There was no access from the house to the basement except for around back. And they had a pool table in that basement. And this gentleman would leave that back door unlocked. And the kids in the neighborhood would go shoot pool. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, I learned to shoot pool at a very young age. Still enjoy to shoot pool. Not very good. But as kids will be kids, we started digging through boxes that were in that basement and came across well, I mean, there's no other term for it, hardcore pornography. This is old 70s bondage, pretty rough stuff. Something that's definitely that a 6 or 7 year old doesn't need to be coming across. Mm-hmm. And while I don't believe that it had a sexual nature for me at that time, I was so young, I do remember that I stole it. Mm-hmm. I stole it and I hid it. And it then became something that I would go to on occasion. And I would look at these images and to do those things. And because of the early exposure, and I will not do it, I could describe to you the images that I saw. They're literally burned into my brain because they were the first images of any kind of sexual nature that I encountered, which actually is a normal human development thing. I just encountered them at an incredibly inappropriate age to do such. So eventually, the hiding place that I had chosen was found by my parents. I don't remember which one it was. I do remember getting in to a significant amount of trouble, probably 5 or 6 months after I had taken them. And there wasn't any question as to where I'd gotten it. I don't think they were concerned about that. I think it was more the shock that their 7-year-old had access to this kind of material. So I think my parents' reaction to it actually was fairly normal. As shocked as I would have been with my own child.
Mm-hmm. What happened? So after that incident and they found it, what happened next with that?
So at 11 years old, we moved from Martinsville, Virginia to Roanoke, Virginia, and moved into the neighborhood. And I met a young man about 6 months younger than I am that lived 2 houses away, and very quickly over that summer became friends. And in a very short time became best friends. Spending quite a bit of time together. His family life was much more stable than mine. So I was spending, from the minute I got home from school until, the proverbial street lights came on and it was time to go home, I would spend at Jared's house. And it became an area of safety and security for me. And it was there. So now you have, fast forward a couple years, 2 13-year-old boys that are there. And I don't remember where it came from. But again, 2 13-year-old boys gained access to some print pornography. I'm much older than the internet. And we had that and we hid it. And as teenage boys, it was something that we knew was taboo, and it was thrilling. I'm not sure we really understood in any ways and means, but and I don't know how uncommon that is. Mm-hmm. Just that experience. I have a 13-year-old son. I don't want him to have that experience, but I don't know how many other people at 13 years old didn't have the same experience coming across a Playboy magazine or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. Fast forward a year and things started to radically shift. My friend Jared, this is still something hard for me to talk about. My friend Jared developed lymphomic cancer, and after 8 or 9 months, he passed away. And my world, the bottom dropped out. Maybe 5 or 6 months before he passed, I had a cousin that was 8 months older than I was, and he passed away. So to have those two things back to back, and my dad's drinking getting worse, and the fighting in my home getting worse, I was emotionally on an island. My mother was treading water to just deal with what's going on at home herself. I had a sister that's 3.5 years older than I was, which is a large enough age gap that we were there for each other, but we didn't spend time together. Mm-hmm. And so when my friend Jared died, within 2 days, I snuck into his house and I stole that pornography, telling myself that I was protecting his mother from finding it. But in reality, at that time, I began using pornography and masturbation as a drug to soothe the pain that I was going through with my family, with the loss of my cousin, and now the loss of my best friend. Now, I certainly didn't realize that at that time, that that's what I was doing. But that's absolutely what I was doing. As I've worked through these issues over the years, that's completely what I was doing. A lot of people think of addiction being alcohol or drugs. And for me and for millions of others, pornography can be just as a crippling addiction. And as my story goes on, you'll see.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you something about Jared's death. You said that his family was much more stable than yours. So when you lost him, was it almost also like losing that family and that stability that you had in his home life?
I absolutely believe so, because I mean, you have somewhere that you go every day and spend 3 and 4 hours every day with, a family every day, and then it just stops. Because, I mean, I guess I could have, but how strange would it be for me to go over there and hang out? It's not like I never saw them again. And as a matter of fact, I'm still in contact with his sister. And I haven't seen her in years, but we haven't lost touch in years either. But yeah, so I definitely think that was, just part of it was the stark reality of I lost a safe place.
Mm-hmm. What do you think made you turn to the pornography as your coping mechanism? I know you say it was an addiction, and those are, they are often intertwined. So what do you think brought you to that place?
I think part of it was the hormonal jumble that a 13, 14-year-old boy is. I was 14 at this time. Obviously, the natural curiosity that's a boy of that same age also. And then it was the availability. It was something that was secret. It was something that was mine. It was something that sounds so weird to say it, that my family of origin couldn't take it away, and they couldn't change it if they didn't know about it. But then the cycle of all of that is when you're hiding things, there's shame, and shame leads to, fear and pain. And that just drives that whole cycle of addiction. And also, again, in that just hormonal soup that is a teenage boy, obviously there was a payoff in that pornography, which was something that was very new to me. And a euphoric feeling and a euphoric high, however fleeting that it was. So I don't think from the moment I stole those magazines, it became an addiction. I think the use of that, viewing that material and masturbation, I hope that's a word I can say on your podcast.
You can say almost any word on this podcast, so it's totally fine.
Well, it's part of this story, and it's part of what happened to me. And so I think that it set up the cycle on that date. It wasn't that I became addicted on that day. It's that it set up this cycle that began to roll. And, you know, oftentimes very few people become alcoholics after their first drink.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it sets up that cycle that to where those things can begin tumbling completely out of control.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about those teen years and going through that. Do you feel like the pornography ever affected how you viewed women and relationships with women?
Well, it's very interesting because within the next year, um, my parents got divorced and my mother started going to a new church. And at in between, 15, getting ready to turn 16 in the fall, I was posed with the option of going and spending 2 weeks with my father in his not so fantastic apartment without cable or a Nintendo. And
The important things.
You're right. And I'm dating myself because that's the NES that I'm speaking of. But, or I could go to church camp with this new church that my mother was attending. And I chose this camp. Consequently, that's where I got to know your husband a little bit better. We had always gone to school together. He was a grade above me. But your husband was at this camp, actually.
I did not know
summer.
this.
Oh, yeah. And so when I got to that camp, I had been part of a Christmas Easter family. We attended church on, religious holidays and things, and I'd been taught about God. But the experience that I had with this new church was one of talking about having a relationship with Jesus Christ and talking about surrendering your life and your sins to Christ and asking Him to be your Lord and Savior. And I realized about day 2 into this camp that most of the kids at this church had a whole other concept of faith than what I thought it was. I thought it was check marks on Sundays, and these kids were excited about worship, and they were, I was like, okay, yay. Well, through the week, obviously, this is something that was on me, and I believe it was absolutely a spiritual thing. And at the end of the week, I'll never forget, a pastor named Gary Key gave an invitation saying that if you would like to know more about a relationship with Christ, and I went forward. I went forward and spoke with a woman who was a dear friend of mine and your husband. We both worked for her years later, named Trish Johnson. And I accepted Christ as Lord and Savior that night. I say all of this because in the midst of that, I was still using pornography and doing those things. Coming back from the camp, I immediately knew pornography was not something that needed to be a part of my new life. And that became a struggle for me, with much more success, but it was still a battle. So to get back to your question, my view of women, and I had not really dated prior to this time, my view of women at this time was the understanding that I needed to date someone else that had a faith similar to mine. And so there was very much this drive in me as a young man to date. I say a woman, I mean, realistically, they were 15, right. To date a young woman that age. And I did limit myself to only dating girls who went to my church. Now, we went to a huge church, so I don't want to make it sound like I limited myself to 3 or 4. Our youth group had 150 people in it. So, and that very much, though, was done even at that age, in an acknowledgement that if I allow myself to act upon these internal desires that I have, it's going to be a problem. So I knew what I saw on paper could not represent what I sought in reality. Does that make sense?
It does. So you kind of answered part of my next question, because I was going to ask about your religious upbringing kind of to that point. So you talked a little bit about that and where you went then. Do you feel like going to that camp and then really getting into the church, was that gaining a new family for you? Was that a place, your new place of safety that you had lost previously?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tenfold. The youth pastor that was there that summer, which was the first summer that I was involved, actually left at the end of that summer, and the church hired a new youth pastor who even stepped into very much a fatherly role for me. Even to this day, someone that I call upon in times of crisis and celebration, and am in contact a whole lot of years later to do these things, to do things like that in my life. So very much so, even to the point that when I was 16, I was offered a job working in the gymnasium at the church. So I was then working at the church 3 and 4 days a week with your husband, by the way. And so very much so, that became my safe place, not only of occupation. It was a fantastic job. I mean, we handed out basketballs and signed people up for aerobics classes. It was a great job. I can't tell, I mean, just, you have to talk to your husband about it sometime, but very much so. And then that became a center point of safety really till I went off to college. Now, I did make friends in 9th grade with another person that lived in my neighborhood, and he ended up being my college roommate, and his family also very much fulfilled that role. By the time my parents divorced, my mom worked 2 jobs, and I know that I ate 2 to 3 meals a week with this other family because Betty knew that I was going to go home and eat leftovers. So I was very fortunate.
As you were gaining more traction in the church, you were spending more time there. It was really becoming a bigger part of your life. And I know as we go through chronologically, it's going to become an even bigger part of your life. How were you reconciling your pornography with church and those two polar opposites?
And that's the thing, and you're absolutely right, because those two things were completely coinciding with my life. It was a constant mental battle and drain. I knew it was wrong. I believe the Holy Spirit convicting me that it was wrong. Yet I still hadn't found anything that that numbed, that's the exact word, that numbed all this pain, shame, and fear that I had in me. And I'd like to say that I was the super faith warrior, and that, at 15, I gave it all over to Jesus, and I had nothing to fear and nothing to do that kind of stuff. And, to some extent, without the pornography, that's even something that I think every Christian deals with today, if they're honest. So few are. But I hadn't found that. What I had found is, like you said, I had a home. I definitely had a faith that I believe is real, but there was this one thing that I couldn't let go of. I kept it secret from my girlfriends. I dated a girl for 2 years at one point, and we never did anything but kiss. Because I knew in real life I could not let my fantasy life and my real life coincide. My gosh, it was causing me so much struggle then. And I couldn't imagine what I would have done. I do want to make this clear that while I find pornography abhorrent, and it's something that, because it set such a trap for me that I willingly walked into, I'm not trying to come down on anybody who that's something that's part of their life. For me, in my life, in my faith, It's something that I struggled with for a long time. And it was that struggle that continued more problems. But scripture is fairly clear of where sexual morality falls into, how God feels about it. So I couldn't just deny that part and be like, well, we're going to erase that part of the Bible. But I also don't want to come like I'm condemning anybody that A is in the middle of this or B doesn't think it's a big deal. This is my story and this is where where I'm coming from. So as far as how I reconciled the two, I didn't. I became the master of compartmentalizing it. This was a separate part of my life and nobody knows about it. And I think that I was even deluding myself to think that my God didn't know about it, which is ludicrous. But it made me feel better to think like he did. Or the opinion of, well, I don't do drugs and I don't do this and I don't do this and I don't do this. So having this one thing on the side is not that big of a deal. But I also got very caught up in the performance game, which is what led into the insanity it caused for me. Because I also felt like there was this, I had to be perfect for God, which again is really sick theology. But again, it just, everything fed into that pain, shame, and fear cycle, which is what drove the use of pornography. And then the temporary release from that feeling. And then afterward, the pain, shame, and fear would just continue to mount up. And I took everything negative in my life and I threw it over into this compartment off to the side. And that builds a powder keg after a while.
It absolutely does. And what I want to point out about a lot of the things that you just said is it really is an addiction. Because when you look at people who are alcoholics or have some type of drug addiction, they will use the exact same words. They will do the rationalizing that you mentioned of, well, I'm not doing this or I'm not doing that. Well, yeah, I drink all the time, but I don't drive drunk. Or, well, yeah, I do meth, but only once a week or whatever. There's that rationalization. I don't know how often you do meth. I'm not sure. Not you, but if you're a meth addict.
Yep. For the record, it's none.
Right. Well, yeah, for you, it's none. For me, it's none. Anybody who does meth, let us know in the comments how often you're supposed to do it. I have no idea.
Wow, you opened that can.
I know, right? We'll see what happens. But I do want people to understand that that's what we're talking about is an addiction. And it's just like any other addiction in how it takes hold of you and how other people can look and say, well, I mean, I look at Playboy, it's fine. Like, it's no big deal. It's fine. And for them, it might be fine. Like you said, it's not a judgment on another person or on their behavior, but in your life, it created that cycle. It created that shame. And as we're going to talk about, it created that powder keg that eventually caused a whole other situation to occur. So let's talk about your next few years and how your addiction played a part in your life.
So, at night, after I started college, I went to a year and a half of community college. And at 19 years old, having worked in the church for 3 years now, having worked alongside of the wonderful youth pastor that we had, I really enjoyed working in the church and being with people and doing ministry, participating in vacation Bible schools and mission trips through our church and doing those things. And I really started to be interested in that. So I one day that I was at work, I left with permission. I left the gymnasium and I went down to the main office to where our pastor was. And I literally just said to him, I said, how do you become a pastor? Like, how does one become a pastor? Like, I didn't know. I'm 19 years old. I had no idea. And so he started talking to me about it. I said, well, I really feel like that's something that I'm interested in doing. And he said, well, do you feel like you're being called to do that? And I said, well, it's something that's just on my heart and on my mind all the time. And very wisely, this gentleman said to me, he said, I'm going to tell you what, I want to call your mother. I want the three of us to sit down and talk about this. And we sat down and talked about it in Dr. Fuller's office, and kind of talked to me what the realities of that would be, what it would look like, but then said, here's what I want us to do. I want you and your mother and the youth pastor and I are going to pray about this for a month. And we're going to commit to pray about this for a month. And we're going to kind of get back together and we're going to talk about this in a month and see kind of where we're at. And I'm telling you, in the next month, man, I was excited to pray about this. I was excited to do this. And I was talking about it with my mother, and I did not talk to the pastor and my youth minister about it. They knew about it because I wanted to wait until we got back together at that time. But during this time, my, at the time, atheist grandmother, she actually late in life came to believe because of the witness of my uncle. But my, at the time, atheist grandmother, who did not go to church, was pretty disgusted with church, told me, she said, you would make a really good minister, which just blew me away. This was during this time period. So we all got back together after a month, and we met together, we prayed, and we did this. And, I reassured the pastor and my mom and them. I was like, I really think this is something I want to pursue. I think this is something God's laid upon my heart. And from that point on, I had a goal and a vision that I'd never had. I was going to college because both of my parents are college graduates, and all four of my grandparents were college graduates. There was never a question of was I going to go to college. It was a matter of where. Mm-hmm. And at that point, my focus changed, and I moved from the community college to a Baptist college in Tennessee, Carson Newman College, and went down there and had a wonderful experience while I was at Carson Newman. However, now I'm living on my own. Mm-hmm. I have nothing to hide from anyone at this point. I have my own place, and I am free to my own vices. And I'm over the age of 18, and I can freely purchase pornographic materials. And so again, here I am following this track of ministry, and I take the newfound freedom I have in my being away from home and double down. It's more material. It is, it's not what I can find, it's what I can buy. And it becomes, something that just becomes a more regular part of my life, because you don't even have to hide it when you have your own apartment. Mm-hmm. It's just, but then again, I completely hid it from everyone I knew. As a member of the Baptist Student Union, as a participating member of the Baptist Student Union, on in through college, and we'll get to her in a minute, but I met someone and we dated. She never knew anything about it. I was supply preaching at churches, I bet you I've preached at churches to 10 people before when I was in college. Mm-hmm. Just, hey, we need somebody. And I was the warm body that was willing to do this. And all the while, I don't have a specific memory for this, but I'm fairly certain there are days that I went from sermon prep right into watching pornography or looking at pornography. Mm-hmm. And I was so practiced at compartmentalizing that it didn't bother me at all. I was fully deluded at this point that I could completely live these two lives.
I want to ask you, do you feel like there was ever any part of you that believed if you became a minister and really kind of took the ultimate religious path, that in some way would absolve the pornography sin?
I don't think I cared. I think I had so successfully separated the two things that one was completely free of the other. I believe at this part, consciously, subconsciously, this was murdering me.
Mm-hmm.
But consciously, as long as no one found out, no one was getting hurt. And therefore, it's not an issue. It's a non issue, it's a non sequitur. And there was no part of me trying to erase this because at this point in my life, there was no part of me trying to correct it anymore. I had fully embraced it and fully compartmentalized it. So, on a conscious level, it didn't even bother me. I was even sanctimonious about, I'll just be flat honest at a young age, about some other people's ways of life
Mm-hmm.
and the way that they acted and the way that they lived. Because they lived it out in the open, somehow keeping it secret from somebody made me better. But I think that's how far I had separated them.
Talk to me about your relationship, your marriage that came to be. And so you went from living on your own, so you can do whatever, you don't really have to hide it because it's within your own four walls. But now you have a wife. So we have to go back to a more secret path. What was that like?
So my junior year of college, I met a girl who was a senior, although I was older than her just because I have one of those weird birthdays. And she graduated, and then we dated all the way through my senior year. And from that point, I moved from my college to where I was going to do my master's program at a seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And after I got established in Louisville, she and I got married, and she moved to Louisville, Kentucky. And it was exactly that situation. It was back to, remember, she had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
It was certainly not anything I had exposed her to. She never participated in it. And it was back to hiding it. And I've been hiding it all along, obviously, but I didn't have to hide it from anybody.
Mm-hmm.
It was physically hiding it and hiding my behaviors from somebody. Definitely began to refeed that pain, shame, and fear cycle a lot more. I'm not going to say that I was happily looking at pornography through college, but it didn't bother me.
Mm-hmm.
Once I began hiding it from my then wife, it began to feed that cycle again. And that cycle leads to, the old joke. It's not a joke, but the old word is that it ends in jail, the insane asylum, or death.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't believe that. I absolutely did not believe that. And but it began to feed that again. And a little thing called the internet also became readily available at that time. So a whole new world of awfulness became available. So it no longer became physical medium that I had to hide under the bed. It was as long as I deleted my browser folders every night at 2 a.m. because I was in school full time and working full time. So I was up till 2 and 3 in the morning every night because I was in school doing homework, going to school during the day, working second shift, coming home, doing 3-4 hours of homework, going to bed, getting 4 hours of sleep. A real healthy lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Although in my 20s I was able to do it.
Right.
There's no way today. But obviously, as I'm starting to do that, and eventually, the issue became exposed. The issue became exposed because I didn't delete all my browser history, and it became a problem. And so, about a year into our marriage, she was very upset, and she had been raised in a Christian home, and to do things, and the first wedge between us was, no, let me amend that. I drove the first wedge secretly when I decided to continue doing what I was doing. When she became aware of it, she became aware of the first wedge that was there. And looking back on it, that wedge became irreparable. The marriage went down from here. I'm not going to discuss her fallacies in the marriage. They were on both sides. I will accept the responsibility, though, that I was not a good husband. I was viewing pornography on a daily, multi-time daily basis at this point in my life. Work and school became my focus, not my new marriage, and it did not lay a foundation for a healthy marriage relationship. And after 2.5 years, it dissolved.
Were you ever afraid that she was going to reveal your secret to others and expose you, particularly thinking about your college and what you're working towards? Was that a fear of yours?
The college was not made aware, but her family and my family were made very aware. And that should have been a wake-up call to me. At that time, I began seeing a 12-step group for sexual addiction, only because she told me I had to, which is not the motivation to seek help. And things got better for a while, but only because it was the fear of losing the relationship. Once the relationship dissolved, I literally said to hell with it, and fully embraced those bad habits again. I'm not going to say that during that 2-year period I was anything close to perfect, but it was the first time that I really tried to put the brakes on it, because I felt like there was something on the line. But the damage was done. And, the marriage was not going to be saved. And, I regret, I've not talked to that person in 25 years. Probably don't need to, but definitely do regret that the damage that I did, because I never owned it. I never owned it at the time,
So after that, you're on your own again. Did you feel better? Because again, you're in that place of not having to hide and not having to worry about not deleting your browser history and being found out.
There certainly was safety in that. With less accountability, certainly becomes less shame. Pretty much at this point in my life, I had dropped out of church. I graduated from seminary and quit going to church. Isn't that awesome? Nobody wanted to hire the newly divorced guy. And I was just honestly not ready, because everywhere I went in the Louisville area to go to church, they'd ask me where my wife was. And it was still fresh and raw. And although, I may have been the catalyst for that, I wasn't ready to talk about it. So you step out for a few weeks, and a few weeks becomes a few months, and a few months becomes a few years. It gets real easy like that. And so I had pretty much at that point embraced a secular lifestyle. I was rebelling against my faith. There's no, term for it. So I wasn't feeling pain, shame, or fear, because at that point in my life, I didn't care. I joke about the fact the lightest weight that I've ever weighed as an adult was during this time, 220 pounds. I now push 280. But 220 pounds, and quite honestly, looked pretty darn good in a suit. at that weight, but I was on what I called the CAN diet. It was the caffeine, alcohol, nicotine diet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny that when you eat, drink 3 pots of coffee a day, 8, 10 beers a night, smoke 2 packs of cigarettes, you can keep the weight off. I look like crap, but to do those things. So I was not healthy. I was mentally in a dark, dark place. I worked. I went out and drank after work, and I came home. My friends were drinking friends,
Mm-hmm.
with the exception of one individual, 2 individuals. Um, all of my friends were just drinking friends, and if we weren't at a bar or at a party, I didn't see them. And I thought I was living the time of my life, and after about 2 years of that, I was exhausted. Actually, it's kind of a funny story. I got back into church because of one thing that happened. I find myself at a party in a very rich neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky. Remember, 2 years prior, I was in the halls of the largest seminary in the world. 2 years later, I found myself at a party, and I walked into a room at the party, and there was a mirrored top table with probably a 1/4 kilo of cocaine on it, and the walls had guns hanging all over the walls, like a loadout room.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked in there, and it scared the crap out of me. And I thought, how have I gone from I was going to be a pastor to cocaine and firearms in 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
It scared me to death. It scared me to death. And it was that next week that I decided I've got to find a healthy church. I've got to find somewhere, because this path is leading to nowhere. Now, was not going to address the pornography issue yet, but the party lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
that was over the line for me. To do that, but still mentally, I was in a scary place. I was in a very scary place.
So you moved past that scary place for the most part. You found a new wife and you made it back to the church. So can you talk a little bit about getting back into the church and how that felt?
So the 10-cent version was I found a church shortly after that horrible experience at the party. Was going there about 6 weeks. Actually, a person that I had graduated with was one of the pastors there. And I knew he was sane, so I checked out his church. I got involved in the young adult ministry that was there. There was this beautiful blonde that was there after about 6 weeks. And after the first time I saw her, I was like, I'm going to get to know this girl. 2 weeks after I met her, she was having a young adults class event at her house to paint her new condo, which is a really bad idea to have your untrained painter friends come paint your condo, and they ruined it. And I could tell through the night she was upset because it looked like garbage. So I made my move, and I said, now, all of this is true. I made my move, and I told her, I said, hey, look, I worked on the paint crew for 2 summers when I was in college. I can come back tomorrow night. We can fix this. And she was like, are you serious? And I was like, in my head, I'm like, yeah, free reason to spend time with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I brought dinner, brought Chinese, and I spent till like 1 a.m. on a work night, only for love, right?
Right.
And did that. And virtually from that day forward, we saw each other every single day, until the point that we got engaged and got married. During that first year that we were married, she and I were both working in social work at the time, and I really started feeling the pressure of that calling I had at 19 years old, that I had never fulfilled in any large, meaningful task and way that was there. And I began sharing that with her, and I said, I really feel like, and by the way, by the time we were married, she knew about my pornography. She knew that this was a struggle for me and that I had, during this time, I had limited it extremely. She didn't know that it continued, but it wasn't every day.
Mm-hmm.
It was, again, that situation. I have something on the line. I don't want to lose it. And she did not and have never fed my pain, shame, fear cycle. So that was new in my life.
Mm-hmm.
To have someone close to me that did not feed that cycle. And so in that first year of marriage, I'd said, I really feel that, I need to be working with young people. And she revealed to me in tears that she'd been praying about the same thing and was scared to tell me because she didn't know what my reaction would be. And so resumes go out, takes about 7 or 8 months. We find a church, interviewed at several, find a church, because most Baptist churches aren't looking to hire someone who's had a previous marriage. Found a church that had a chairman of deacons and director of the search committee who had been married previously, so it was not an issue for him. And they brought us aboard. And I'm going to tell you that during the first 3 or 4 years there at the church, it was a fruitful ministry, and God blessed it. I was really fulfilling what I believe God had laid on, and I still believe that God had laid upon my heart at the time of my life. Pornography was not something that was part of my life for those 3.5 to 4 years that were there, because life was good. I had nothing feeding the pain, shame, and fear thing. We saw, I'm trying to remember what the word is. There's a word that's used for this. It's not catastrophic because that's a negative term. But we saw growth at a rate in the youth ministry that was so fast and so high, it was difficult administratively to keep up with it. Mm-hmm. Within 2 years, we go from 8 kids on a Wednesday night to 75. And, 55 baptisms in 1 year. And that the Lord is really, really just moving and doing these things. And I believe completely that was because I was not living in the cycle. The problem was I still had never addressed the issues that had originally driven that cycle. And just like everything, every season in life is going to change. Mm-hmm. And it changed. And things in the church got difficult. I'm not going to address those things. So far to say that I'm responsible for my actions and reactions, and they're responsible for theirs. Mm-hmm. They terminated the pastor abruptly for a non-biblical reason. Basically, we just don't like you. The worship pastor I had worked with appropriately left, but I was scared and I didn't. Mm-hmm. And I stayed. And for 1.5 years, I was the only full-time staff member. And I took on all the duties of the clergy of the church. Yet being directed by a personnel committee and a deacons committee that approved or did not approve what I was supposed to do, regardless of where I felt I was being led to do. Mm-hmm. By God. Claudia, in all reality, I should have left right then. I should have. And fear, because of my previous marriage and the difficulty in finding a church the first time, kept me there. And as the pain, shame, and fear, the threats of my job, because of some of my actions, not related to pornography, but temper and other things, they began to feed that monster again. And it wasn't long until I went right back into my pattern. How do I soothe this pain, shame, and fear? Let's go with what's worked for 20 some years. And let's just continue to feed this and to go through that. I'll let you ask your next question before I get into what goes beyond there.
That's probably my next question. So you get back into that cycle, and I'm sure even though you were in a bad place, there was a level of comfort there, because we often don't like change, or we appreciate comfortable situations even when they're not the healthiest situation. So you're back in this place that even though it's that negative cycle, it has comfort because you're familiar with it. You know, it numbs the pain. But then you get to a point where we'll say you have that catastrophic event and things are discovered. So will you talk a little bit about that?
So, things continue to get worse at the church. Again, I should have left long before this, to the point that finally we realized we have to move on. That ministry in this church is going to be impossible because of things that were said by me, things that were said by them, to the point that it was an impasse and likely would have led to my termination had I not, and I did, gracefully leave. I found another church and announced my resignation. The church was somewhat split. Half of them wanted me to stay. Half of them were glad that I was going to go. They could have a clean slate with all new staff members, and we left. And I will be honest, though, the church was very gracious in our leaving, into doing these things. So I take a new church. We moved to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and new church has no idea about this dark part of my life. Obviously, not something I talked about in the interview. Only talked about the part that I, was good. Was asked by the pastor if pornography or sexual immorality was something I struggle with. I looked him dead in the face and told him no, because that's how far I had compartmentalized it. I'm there about 2 months. We come at the beginning of the summer. I'm able to finish up VBS. I'm able to take the kids to camp. I'm able to take the youth to camp. We get back from camp, and I get a phone call in late June from a member of my former church, and they tell me that they've found things on my computer. And I immediately call another person at that church, and they said, we feel the necessity that we need to tell your current church. At the time, I thought they were horrible for this. 10 plus years removed, I'm like, yeah, nobody wants their clergy involved in this activity. I understand where they sent me in good faith to this church and then find this information out. They had due diligence to do this. So I hold no ill will for that. My reaction is I suffered through the 2 worship services that morning at the church. It was a call on Sunday morning. I went out to lunch with my wife and my son. My wife and my then 3.5-year-old son dropped me off at church. I remember kissing my wife goodbye. I remember opening the back door and kissing my son goodbye, knowing good and well that I was going to walk into that church and kill myself. I was not able to get to my home to get a firearm. That's a blessing now, because we lived about 10 miles away. We went out to lunch after church and came right back to the church. I stayed at church on Sundays all day. It's a work day for ministers. All I had was a razor blade or a straight razor. And I sliced and bisected both wrists and significantly sliced my neck. on the right-hand side. I'm told I lost about 5.5 pints of blood and was found by our educational minister, who called 911. I have no memories of that. At this point, I was passed out on the floor in a bathroom stall. I do remember being in the ambulance. I remember struggling in the ambulance because my back hurt, which I don't know why. Mm-hmm. And I remember them taking me out of the ambulance and passing under the doors that lead into the hospital, and I lost consciousness again at that point. At that point, I was ER, taken into vascular surgery. The vascular surgeon told me later that I did code on the table. And my next memory, though, is 3 days later. 3 days later, 2 days later, I'm sorry. As the morphine that they had me on is wearing off, I woke up. I know it's kind of weird, but there's a really funny story with this. One of the pastors that I worked with was African American, Pastor Eric. And when I woke up, Pastor Eric had his hands on my face and was in my face. Mm-hmm. And I remember my first thought after waking up was, holy cow, Jesus is black. Was the very first thought that I had. Because when I woke up, I remembered what I did. Morphine drip kicked in. I woke up again after the morphine wore out. The second thought that I had was, this is one more thing I'm really bad at. So even in my failed suicide attempt, I was feeding my pain, shame, and fear. Morphine kicks in again because it's on a time pump. The third time I woke up, it got real because my wife was there. And then adrenaline or whatever cleared my mind of all that morphine and the reality of everything. So during the time of those 2 days that I was in the hospital, not conscious, my wife had been contacted, and the reality of it all had been exposed to her and told to her appropriately. The church I was serving in at the time absolutely rallied around my wife. Over the next 3 or 4 days, I had several visits from key people in the church, at which point they asked me for my resignation, not for the use of pornography, but because it was very clear that I was not fit and stable mentally to be serving in a church in a past capacity as a youth pastor. And I scrawled out my resignation on a piece of paper, and they continued to be very gracious to my wife and I during that time that was there. And I spent 7 days on a psych unit. It would have been 4, but it just so happened to fall into the 4th of July holiday, and they don't discharge over holidays. So I'll never forget fireworks out of the psych ward window. And I sat there for 7 days knowing the world's been rocked. I rocked the world, not in a positive way, and that it's all going to have to change from here.
I want to ask you a question really quickly that's not related to you, but when you were talking about your former church and that they contacted you and said, we feel we have to contact your current church and let them know. Now, there's a lot of talk, especially lately, on the internet about churches covering things up, hiding things of an inappropriate nature, of their staff members. So what do you think about those churches that might just push things under the rug versus what yours did in the best interest of your current church?
Oh, I think they absolutely did the right thing. It took me years to understand that. But they absolutely did the right thing. They certainly didn't know to what depths my issue went. And anytime you're working with children and youth, you can't be like, oh, it's just this. It's not the next level and the next level and the next level. It wasn't, but they certainly didn't know that. So I think that they did the right thing. I think churches that now, I'll also say that they handled it judiciously within the community there. Word got around, but my former church didn't and could have had every right to throw me under the bus.
But did
they They did not. Absolutely did not. And I'm thankful for that. It was actually afterwards that I shared details with a lot of people in that community of, what went on. And so I'm thankful for that. I think the way that they handled it is the way that it needed to be handled. I did not think that in the moment. But I was still so sick at the time that, I didn't need to be making that call. So I think the only way that you can handle it is handle it right up front. I'm not saying you have to make it front page news. But you can't sweep it under the rug, and you can't do that. I really feel like their consideration for handling it the way that they did was probably much more for Jennifer and Caleb, my son, than it was for me. I honestly did not deserve a whole lot of consideration at that point.
Let's talk about your redemption, because that's really the most amazing part of your story. So you hit rock bottom and you made the decision, right? You made the decision that, no, this is not the life I want. This is not okay. I'm not going to give up. I want to fight for a better marriage, relationship with my son, life for myself. And I know you and I have talked about previously the most difficult person to give you forgiveness, and that was yourself. So will you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, and nobody wants to talk about this, but there are consequences to our actions. And the only way to deal with a fall from grace or rock bottom situation is to own it and accept the consequences. Number one thing, my wife took my cell phone and goes, nope, not having it. You don't have access. You don't have internet access. You don't have a phone. You don't have internet access. You don't have any of those things. If you've never been in that situation, it's a lot like feeling neutered. But in the current climate that I was in, that was absolutely right. I'd like to tell you that the minute I got out of the hospital that I got off my pity pot, but I did. I sat on my pity pot for about 2 weeks. We plugged into a new church that, by a freak circumstance, a lifelong friend in Louisville went to college with a pastor in Bowling Green who met with us, and he just looked at me and goes, get a job. And I was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. He goes, I didn't ask you to tell me what you're going to do. I told you to go get a job. Just go get a job. And okay. And then Jennifer was like, yeah, get a job. And I was doing anything she told me to do at that point. So I went and got a job. I started working for $10 an hour, which is significantly less than I was making previously. But I had a job, and I had at least a daily purpose, a reason to get up and go to work. And I went and did a extremely menial $10 job. Meantime, plugging into a new church, a new church that has a marriage ministry and has a class that's all about rebuilding the foundations of your marriage. Well, if we needed anything after the rock that I had just blown up, we needed that. We got involved in this class. So I worked this menial job for about 5 months and still making $10 an hour and no prospect. And we had been praying in this group with this group and going to Sunday night Bible studies and really involving ourselves in the church and meeting healthy couples. We needed that really, really badly. And finally, the leader of this group, after about 6 weeks of me saying I really just need more gainful employment, he came up to me after church one Sunday. He goes, "Can you turn a wrench?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." I said, "I like to work with my hands. I like to build wood furniture and to do stuff like that." And he goes, "I own a business. Why don't you show up Monday, the next Monday, so a week?" And I showed up, and he offered me a job at $2 more an hour. And that was more meaningful employment because there was a process to where you can continue to build yourself. So self-esteem still, is being built, and to do these things. Pornography is not part of my life. My wife and I adopted just some basic guidelines that are like, I am to live present in my emotions, and when they're weak, I have to admit that she had the right and access, even once I got a cell phone back, that she could go through it. That she could call me on any behavior that she found suspect. And these are all things that I would have taken great offense to before, but it's just part of the consequences of where I had gone to. And I had to give up some of that privacy because look what I had done with it. I had created this whole false narrative and had a compartmentalized part of my life that she was not aware was active in a problem. So that went on for several years and getting healthier and healthier. I will tell you that I have a professional degree and a master's degree in Christian education and theology, and I learned more about the application and definition of faith and forgiveness in the actions of my wife following that. She had every reason to kick me to the curb. I just almost destroyed her life. And my sons too. So by living day to day, being present, making sure that, my priorities go Jesus, Jennifer, Caleb, and then me. Always that has to be the priorities that I put forward, because as soon as I put me first, I screw it up. And that went on for years, and it was progressively, it was better and better. But I still had some issues that I hadn't addressed in my life. And while I was not treating them with the pornography, it was still causing me a great deal of depression and difficulty. And in 2019, so this is recent, in 2019, I began talking with one of our pastors that I'd known, obviously at that point for 8 years, and just talking with him. And he worked me through some really basic stuff that Claudia, I knew it here. I didn't know it here. And it was in March of 2019. And I can't tell you the exact day, but I can tell you the exact feeling. I let it go. I finally forgave myself. Everybody else had forgiven me, and I hadn't. And that was that little thing that was still feeding that pain, shame, and fear. I joke, but I'm in all seriousness. How in the heck would I have dealt with the stress of COVID in early 2020 if I hadn't dealt with that? And for me, it was that notion of finally being able to forgive myself and realizing that in my God's eyes, I wasn't lesser. it was in my eyes. And that for years, not since my suicide attempt, since my childhood, I had believed this lie that I was just a piece of crap. I was never good enough and never gonna, it just wasn't ever gonna be good enough to do that. And that's not to say that I've grown complacent, because I'm constantly striving to do more and to do better. It's that when I don't tear myself down. And in the last 2 years, there have been several situations. My father had a catastrophic automobile accident. Was in the hospital for about 8 months recovering from it. Broke 39 bones in his body during the course of that. I can't, and he lived in Virginia. I can only go back and see him every 3 or 4 months. I would have internalized all that as to I'm a terrible son. I'm not fulfilling what I should, helping an elderly father to do these things. And I would have made that awful situation that was about him, about me, and it would have just fed into this whole cycle that was there. And I'm just so grateful that I've finally fully been released of that. I almost, it sounds weird, I don't. I now can identify the situations that would have made me feel terrible. And when I don't feel terrible about it, I have to check myself and not feel terrible for not feeling terrible. But it's just that freeing thing to realize that perfection's not achievable. And if my God is not disappointed in me, who am I to be disappointed in myself?
Do you ever fear that you will hit that cycle again?
You never say never, because I think you set yourself up for failure when you do that. The reality is through my faith and through learned coping mechanisms, through boundaries that my wife and I have set up, there are so many more avenues to handle these things before they get to that situation that is there. There are so many different things that I've learned. I'm not going to sit here and tell you in the last 10 years that there haven't been struggles. That would just be a lie. But I will tell you that in the moments of struggle, there is not the repetitive cycle that just the whirlpool that just sucks you down and you become lost. And part of that is knowing where it led, but part of it is what I've learned, what people have taught me, what God has shown me, the grace and love and support that I've had from my wife. I mean, literally, she stuck with me through that. She'll stick with me through it. She might kill me, but that's just, but I mean, really, it just, so I would never, ever be so arrogant to say, no, this can't happen again. Because I think the moment I do that, I'm setting myself up for failure, because it now is a case of being ever vigilant to stay emotionally and spiritually healthy enough to where I never go to that dark place again. And sometimes that's a daily reminder. And then when things are flying high, sometimes I don't have to think about it a whole lot.
You just can never be complacent.
No, absolutely not. And, in reality, we can say that for all kinds of things. Who wants to be complacent in their marriage? Who wants to be complacent in their job? It's almost one of those things that standing still is moving backwards. That you've got to put effort into all of these things, not to exhaustion, but just to say, it's good enough. I'm not going to settle for that. My wife certainly shouldn't settle for that. My son, shouldn't do that. I've got a great kid, man. He's just I've created a monster. He's so sarcastic. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you this as a joke. He said that he was going to bust into this room tonight and rickroll your audience. I asked him to please not do so.
Next episode, I want to see it. So you have a marriage that is stronger than it ever was. You have a firecracker of a young man that you are raising. I would love to hear some relationship advice from you for the audience.
I really kind of already covered this again earlier, and I mean, I would say it again. For me, it's definitely putting me, well, I said, Jesus, Jennifer, Caleb, me, and honest to goodness, work comes after that, because I'm no good for work unless I'm pouring some into myself. Mm-hmm. And it is making sure that emotionally and spiritually I'm healthy. It is making sure that Jennifer and I are communicating, that we're spending time together as a family, but spending time together as a couple, in whatever way it works as a couple. It is making sure that I'm plugged in my kids' life, not as a helicopter parent. One thing I rarely heard from my father growing up was, "I love you." My son kind of rolls his eyes at me sometimes. I say it to him every single day, and he knows why. He knows why. He knows the story. None of what I've shared with you tonight is secret from my 13-year-old. By golly, he needs to know, because I never want to see him go down this kind of path that's there. It's making sure that I am okay with me, and to doing all those things, and then pouring into work. And I have a pretty demanding job. Mm-hmm. But my faith and my family and my health even take precedence over that. Don't know that my company would be real proud of that statement, but they don't want the crazy mess that I would be if that was not the order that I set out in front of me there. And it's keeping those goals, and for me, I believe, in that specific order. I think where a lot of families fail with children is one parent or both get more invested in their children than they do their spouse. But if we're being good parents, our children are going to leave one day. Mm-hmm. And you don't want that relationship to have been hollow for 18 years. And how many times do you see that? So our son even knows, like, we have a rule in this house: you don't sit between your mother and I, ever. Not on the couch, not at the dinner table. We are a couple. And because we're a couple, we have you. But even when you're gone, we're still a couple. And we're going to be that couple. And it sounds like a hard lesson for a kid to learn, but I think there's a lot of security then that he has. Because he has friends whose parents have gotten divorced, and Jen and I don't have a perfect marriage. We fuss and fight just like anybody from time to time. But I don't think my kid has ever once gone, "Are my parents going to split up?" Mm-hmm. Because he knows how strong that bond is.
I love that. And I do want to take a moment to step back and say, please, let's normalize taking care of ourselves and our family before work. Because
absolutely,
so many people do throw themselves into work. And I mean, I have done it myself, but if we don't take care of ourselves and our family, we're no good for anybody. So thank you for pointing that out and making sure that everybody hears that. I want to quickly switch gears. We have talked about some pretty rough things. Well, mostly you have talked about some pretty rough things. I just get to sit here and listen. But I want to wrap up with my favorite, which is tattoos. I have a lot of tattoos. I love tattoos. I am working on my next tattoo. Tell me about your favorite tattoo that you have.
I currently only have one, and part of the reason for that is I am so financially pragmatic that every time I look at getting the next tattoo, I can like pay down the mortgage or, pay off a bill or do this or do that. And it's really not for lack of finances. It's just I'm so fiscally conservative sometimes, unless it's board games, in which case.
I feel attacked right now, but it's fine. It's fine.
No. It's good. It is. Please don't, because I'm weird that way. But anyhow, so when I was 15 years old, right after I became a Christian, my mother took me to the Christian bookstore and she bought me what's called witness wear. They're Christian T-shirts.
This is starting out as a weird tattoo story, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, on this Christian T-shirt was a peace sign, and inside of the peace sign was a cross.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it. I bought the shirt. 12 years later, I had that done.
Nice.
On my arm, and I still own the T-shirt.
What?
And it is framed on the ceiling of our game room. So I kept it knowing that I wanted it as a tattoo.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's something that's very important to me. It reflects my faith. It reflects an important change in my life at that time in my life when I did that. I have a very good friend that draws Celtic knotwork.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a band that he's drawn in emerald green and black. And it's going to happen one day. It's going to happen. And I'll get a band on my arm with that. But I absolutely love it. This is tattoo adjacent, but when my son was 10 years old, he came to us and said, "Dad, I want to get an earring." And, that was out of the blue. And I had my ear pierced before. And I said, "Well, tell you what, let's table this for 3 or 4 months. Thinking this is just the whims of a 10-year-old. I don't want to go do any kind of body modification, although that kind of piercing is not really body modification." And 3 months to the day passed by, and he comes and he goes, "I still want an earring." My wife and I talked about it. I thought I was okay with it. And I asked her, I said, "What do you think about me getting one with him?" So we went back 3 years ago, and we both got our ears pierced on the same day. It's really convenient because you can buy one pair of earrings and just split them. And this is my little piece of rebellion. In a lot of faith-based circles, this is extremely frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
I want no part of those churches. I want no part of those churches. I belong to a wonderful church. This is not an issue at all. As a matter of fact, we have pastors on our staff that have multiple tattoos and some piercings. So, but this was just my little, I guess, snub to all of my college professors and seminary professors and those that would have thought that this is clearly a sign that I don't love Jesus, and nothing can be truer from the truth, but also done in unity with my son. I absolutely love it.
Will you take him to get his first tattoo?
If he wants to get one, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, without a question. I mean, so long it's not like on his face or,
yes,
something that's going to prohibit him from getting a job and eventually moving out of my house. And, but yeah, that's certainly not an issue that I would have with that.
Well, when you're ready, there is an amazing artist in your area. So I will gladly give you that recommendation.
Well, that'll be interesting.
Yes.
That'll be interesting.
I'll come and get one with you. I never turned down an opportunity to get a new tattoo.
Maybe that's what we use your excuse for you and Lee to come back out.
I'm in.
Besides, there's a whole other part of the Bourbon Trail that you guys didn't see.
Yes. So tattoos and the Bourbon Trail. Yes. Sign me up.
That's well, Lee and I have actually talked about this. We need to time it around the Derby.
I could rock a good hat, I feel like. So we did have our hat discussion earlier. Well,
yes.
Jeff, I am so grateful that you told your story today. It's going to really be meaningful for so many people to hear the struggles that you went through, but more so the way that you really took responsibility for your actions and took responsibility for your own healing and your forgiveness. So thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've ever publicly told the story.
Wow.
And I knew it was time. When you asked me and I didn't freak, I knew I was ready.
Well, I feel honored. Thank you so much, Jeff. You are an amazing man, amazing husband, and an amazing father.
All right. Thank you very much.
I really hope you guys enjoyed my conversation with Jeff as much as I did. I really appreciate his honesty, his vulnerability, and his willingness to publicly share his story here for the very first time. So remember, until next week, you are strong enough and you are worth it. Thank you for listening to the Strong Enough podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform by searching Strong Enough. And on YouTube, we're available on the Spear Talk channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Strong Enough Pod. If you have suggestions for an upcoming episode or a future guest, please reach out at strongenoughpod@gmail.com. Remember, you are worth it.